Joan of Arc, the woman who with her exploits and cunning became a national heroine, was a patron saint of France and declared a saint after her death. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in Dormy, a small village in northern France, into a peasant family well known in the village. Unfortunately, Joan was born in the middle of one of the most difficult conflicts for France, the famous 100 Years' War. This unscrupulous conflict was intended to overthrow the king, seize his throne and take absolute power over the conquered French lands, continuing the invasion with impunity. For years, this confrontation seemed to have been a time of truce. However, this was not fully complied with by both sides, so that the incessant power struggle lasted for more than 100 years. Joan, during her childhood, did not have access to education because, at that time, women were not considered worthy of receiving such privileges, much less if they did not belong to royalty. Nevertheless, her brother was worthy of receiving an education, as his father considered that teaching his son about letters and numbers was not a waste of time as it was teaching his daughter, as those were the accepted beliefs. However, the religious education received by her parents was paramount, since in the family it was said that the love and absolute worship of God would save and protect them from the English. Joan's mother was a very Catholic woman, and for her religion was the most important thing in life. So from her early years she constantly taught her to worship and ask God before anything else, and always repeated that He would be her only salvation. Thus, thanks to the education and devotion of the time, Joan became an extremely Catholic woman like her parents, and despite the conflict in which her country found itself, she was faithful to her beliefs. At the age of 13, as part of her daily chores, she had a sinister and disturbing situation. The girl said that while she was performing her duties, she heard a deep voice calling her name. She approached little by little to the place where the voice came from, and far from feeling fear, she felt peace. In front of the girl appeared the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine, with a heavenly call telling her with fury that she should continue a religious, devout, and pious life. Her parents, very moved by the story, promulgated the message told by their daughter, and so for a long time, the little peasant girl assured that she was constantly visited by the three celestial entities, who constantly repeated this message to her. A few years passed, and at the age of 16 she assured that she had received a much more important message directly from God. The girl said that God had spoken to her, and in her meeting, He had revealed to her an important mission, which for many did not seem within the reach of an illiterate peasant girl. The mission attributed by the celestial being would have been to lead the French army, to crown as king the dauphin in Reims, and to expel the English from the country, achieving the freedom of her people. After hearing the heavenly words of her messenger, Joan of Arc broke into uncontrollable weeping, for she had felt so much tranquility and desire to fulfill what had been manifested to her that she could not contain herself. Upon hearing the story, many people in the town did not believe her claims and began to label her as crazy, so her father, concerned about the situation, often sought to arrange her marriage with neighbors and friends much older than her, so that they would stop attacking her. But to the father's disgrace, the girl was so devoted to her first revelation to keep herself pure and devout that she never accepted the proposals. And as the feeling and fidelity to God was so great, her father did not want to break his promise and gave up the idea of marrying her. The girl of Dormy during some months revealed her multiple visions and predictions in her community. But as many judged her words and thought that she had fallen into madness, they did not pay attention to her. However, one of her revelations was crucial to gain sympathizers in her hometown because one of her visions came true, and from that moment on, the whole town supported Joan, encouraging her to fulfill her mission imposed by God. In those years, a harsh prophecy haunted France, for it was said that a woman would bring the country to its lowest point, but, after the fall, a virgin woman would arrive to raise France to the top, giving her back her freedom, and many believed that the savior was Joan. Her visions told her to find a lost sword, arm herself and fight against the English so that Charles VII of Valois would be crowned king. The young woman had to go to the home of the next king of France, but Charles lived in Jeanne, a little far from Dormy, so Joan had to try to get out unharmed from her village, which was surrounded by English troops. The way out was practically impossible. However, the woman did not give up in spite of feeling severely threatened. She was eager and determined to fulfill her visions, and she went to the military generals in command and the main rulers of Dormy at that time. The peasant girls sought an audience with the army to ask for support, and thus managed to leave the city well supported and protected by the French troops. During several months, the prophetess woman began to have great popularity and welcome with the people of the town for her pious words, her visions, and predictions that each time devotees were added to support her, believing fervently in her prophecies alluding that she would be the virgin who would save France. With all the support that Joan received, it did not take her long to receive the support of the soldiers who at the beginning branded her as crazy and to obtain a retinue that would escort her to Chinon on her mission to reach Charles. On the other hand, the fame of the woman was so great in the territory that many Frenchmen who betrayed their nation and joined the English side feared that, by the intervention and exaltation of the girl, the settlers and soldiers would take a breath and try to strip the traitors and Englishmen of the invaded territory. Thus, to prevent the peasant girl from continuing with her daring prophecies, they ordered her to look for her in every corner of Dormy, to stop the predictions that conspired against the English and their downfall. To the misfortune of the opposing side, Joan was already on her way to Chinon backed by the military checkpoint, so their search was a total failure. However, to remedy this tragedy, they sacked the entire city. The road to the expected city was too dangerous at that time, as they were exposed to face all kinds of bandits, thieves, murderers, and what was worse, English troops. But despite this, the maiden and her accompanying soldiers accepted the challenge because the words of the girl were stronger than their fear. For the long and risky journey that awaited them, Joan had to dress like a man because at that time it was frowned upon to see a woman accompanied only by men. So to avoid such comments, and even unjust condemnations, she had to cut her long hair and dress in men's clothes. Likewise, as had been revealed to her in her vision, the Savior of France dressed in armor, and carried with her a mighty sword, with which she said she would raise the victory of her nation. After several days, the maiden and her military division arrived at Chinon, where they were well received by the people of the town, because the message and the mission of Joan had reached those lands, and they were very happy to have her in the territory. However, for Carlos, the arrival of the prophet girl did not seem like a good idea, because he did not believe in what was said about the young girl and much less in her supposed prophecies given by the archangel Michael, so he did not want to receive her. After 2 days of seeing the girl waiting for her reception, he decided to put her to the test and thus meditate on her admission. Carlos thought the best way to know that his visitor had not fallen into madness was to present himself to her as a vagabond and not as the future king. So with rags and full of dirt, the incredulous went to Joan and was totally surprised. The young woman recognized him, knelt down on the ground, raised her hands towards heaven, and told him that God had sent her to his abode, for he had entrusted her with the mission of making sure that he would be crowned as the new king of France. Furthermore, she guaranteed that she herself would be the one to help prevent the fall of Orléans, the only city that remained in the fight and who still supported Charles VII of Valois, because during the war years, many cities were heavily invaded, and many others instead joined the English side. Seeing the courage of the maiden, the support that backed her, and especially after she demonstrated that most probably her visions did come from God, the chosen one for the throne accepted to receive her, but not without first calling for an audience and a theological contingent to interrogate her, to make sure and support her visions. For weeks Joan of Arc was subjected to a series of interrogations, where she was repeatedly asked where her visions came from or who told her, and the peasant girl from Dormy always responded by saying that God had revealed her prophecies to her, and that the only way she could prove the veracity of her words was to be allowed to go to the siege in Orléans, to lead the troops and fight for France. Finally, after long days of uncertainty, Charles accepted the request of the strange girl. However, at that time within the city, there were not many professional soldiers left for the young woman to form her own army to travel to Orléans, so in order for her to travel, volunteers were called to support the maiden's mission. Thousands and thousands of people came to the king's call because when they heard that Joan of Arc would lead the new troops on their way to the last city still fighting, so many men were shocked that they wanted to be present in the mission entrusted by God to the new savior. After a long time of preparation, the Savior managed to generate a great unbreakable bond with her fellow soldiers, because throughout all that time the girl lived and shared with them. She dressed and behaved like a soldier, and her words of encouragement and companionship made everyone in her new army came to love and respect her unconditionally. Thus, being ready for battle, Joan led the troops and they set out on a journey to Orléans, where they promised to restore the freedom of France. Unfortunately, when they arrived at the battlefield, the commander of the city and other military leaders did not want to accept her at the front of the conflict, because her military contingent only obeyed her orders. And not only that, but also her own men began to join the lines of the new army, supporting her even more. Only days after her arrival, she had a new revelation, and this time it would be the vision that would give her the courage to open herself to the battlefield regardless of the designs of the military leaders. "God has spoken to me. We must not protect the city, but attack the English troops, and only then will we regain our freedom," said the young girl with a war cry to her entire entourage. The girl affirmed that once again she had a rapprochement with God and that He had revealed to her the way to victory. Joan and her men should no longer protect what was left of the city but should launch themselves into battle and destroy the English troops. The words of the woman were so powerful that the soldiers were armed with courage and went out to the orders of the Maiden to fight as never seen before in history. The already called Savior of France went out with her banner high and led her men with great fervor, managing to finish with several military camps surrounding the city. During the days of the raw struggle, the Savior did not leave her military companions alone but also presided over them from the bloody war zone. The number of fallen English soldiers was much greater than the number of French soldiers, and this encouraged the men who did not abandon their lines for a single moment, together with their blind belief that Joan was the Virgin Savior of Orléans and that she could not die in combat. However, during one of the most critical days of fighting, the Maiden was struck by a fervent arrow that promised to end her life, and she was immediately taken to receive the best medical attention. The soldiers, on seeing their leader fall for brief moments, thought that the prophecies would not come true, and with sadness in their hearts thought that their leader had perished in combat. However, after a few minutes, as if by divine intervention, he ran out again with his banner held high and with a war cry, as if nothing had happened, leaving the doctors and other soldiers astonished. Fortunately, the arrow would have hit the young woman's arm, which did not compromise her life, and she was able to recover her breath. The warriors, upon seeing their leader in battle again, were enlightened, firmly believing that the revelation would come true, and that she really was their savior. This motivated them even more to fight and defend their nation until they finished with the entire Anglo-Saxon battalion. Thus, after 4 days of fighting, Joan and her army finally managed to finish with all the enemy fronts, so the English leaders announced their retreat, finally leaving the city liberated, thanks to the audacity and courage of the one who was called the Maid of Orléans. Joan of Arc had managed to fulfill a part of what she had announced in her visions, but despite the great victory that the woman had, this did not mean the end of the war, for more than half of the nation was still cornered and invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, and what was even worse, Charles was still not crowned king. For de Valois to be officially proclaimed, he had to reach the city of Reims, a city that was totally invaded by the English, and not only that, but it was hundreds of kilometers away from Orléans. The maid did not stop her task, so she began to increase her ranks of soldiers who wished to accompany her. She traveled through invaded towns, eliminating the English troops and recovering their domain, in order to extend a line that would allow them to take Charles to Reims in a safer way. Joan, thanks to her leadership and gallantry, managed to establish strong lines of attack, because in each town she liberated many men joined her great army. At that time, among the customs of liberating or invading new towns, was to loot, abuse their women and destroy everything as a symbol of presence. However, with the command of the young woman, it was not allowed to harm the cities, because in the eyes of God, it was a sin. The Maid of Orléans addressed her soldiers in such a way that they obeyed her every order, without complaint. In addition, since she had left her small native village, she never again wore women's clothing, so much so that she hated the very idea of having to wear it, because she felt much more comfortable with the soldiers' clothing, and she never again let her hair grow and wore it as her companions used to do, something very frowned upon in those years. Joan's popularity grew so much, and she was not only known by the French troops, but also by the English troops, who claimed that the young woman had been possessed by the devil himself, and affirmed that by means of spells, magic, and witchcraft she possessed the soldiers so that they fought with great fury. During her journey to Reims, one of the last cities she faced was Paty, the site where the French military marked their most epic battle of those days, as it was a total victory. Thus, with the road to Reims completely clear, Joan returned personally to Chinon to look for the one who would be the future ruler. After several days, Charles was finally crowned as the new King of France, and with him in power, the Maiden had fulfilled one of her most proclaimed visions. Unfortunately, the monarch began to have an unseemly approach with those who initially betrayed them, as they sought to reach a peace agreement on the territories and their government. This act of the sovereign did not seem at all well to Joan, who had fought too hard to crown him. The girl, a few days after the proclamation of the new monarch, decided to take her men to Paris to try to recover it from the English power. At that time, the capital city was heavily armed and full of Anglo-Saxon soldiers who guarded it. Beyond wanting to recover her territory, the Maiden sought to connect again with God and to have revealing visions that would help her in the war, because for some time she had been saying that she no longer received prophecies. The savior of France believed that recovering the city would make God appear before her again, so she led her entire battalion to a very probable certain death by her own decision, and without the permission of Charles VII. The troops led by the woman fought furiously for several days. However, the English force, strategy, and armament were much greater than them, so after several failed attempts to regain Paris, they had to retreat, thus feeling their first bitter defeat. The rebelliousness of the Maid of Orleans was not well seen by the monarch, because he considered that her disobedient acts put at risk the negotiation with the Burgundy, and ordered her to withdraw all military support, and not to supply her with more resources. This crude decision of the king was not an impediment for Joan, because she continued with the liberation of more cities, but this time she would go for smaller towns, while she recovered the support of Charles. Thus, together with her large military contingent, she went through several communities, fighting and liberating them from the Anglo-Saxons, growing their ranks. However, the young maiden's luck would change when she reached Compiègne, because, after an arduous battle, she was shot down and finally captured by the Burgundy. These, having custody of the Maiden of Orleans, went to the king so that he would pay for her liberation, since thanks to her he had reached the throne, but to the surprise of the captors, Charles VII refused to do so. The monarch believed that Joan represented a serious problem for his negotiations, so he thought it better that the peasant girl be handed over to the English, and thus finally free himself from the girl's rebelliousness. After several months imprisoned, and after several suicide attempts, the Maid of Orleans was finally handed over to the enemy's side. She was taken to the city of Rouen, where a theological court made up of English and French priests tried her for more than 70 charges related to violence, heresy, sorcery, and above all for dressing as a man.